Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Harbor Springs Festival of the Book's inaugural One Bay, One Book community reading event. We're pleased that you can join us tonight as we're honored to feature Brandon Hobson, a 2018 Festival of the Book presenter. We've certainly missed seeing our supporters in person over this past year, but please know that we look forward to welcoming you all again in the coming months as we make plans for additional virtual and in-person events and think ahead to September's Festival of the Book. I'm Glenn Young, Vice Chair of the Board of the Harbor Springs Festival of the Book, and it's my honor to introduce tonight's event, one that we intend as an annual addition to our full year of programming. Programs such as this, however, are only possible with the generous support of others, and tonight we are indebted to our sponsors, which include the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians, Michigan Humanities, Between the Covers Bookstore, and Interlochen Public Radio. In addition, we owe a special thank you to our individual donors. We simply could not provide events like this, the annual September Festival, or programming like Books in the Schools without the generosity of our supporters. If you have not yet given, I encourage you to visit hsfotb.org/donate and support all that we do to make a difference in our communities. Now let me say a word about tonight's format. Margaret Noodin will be joining Brandon to talk about Brandon's newest book, The Removed. Part of the conversation will involve a question and answer period. And while many questions have been submitted already, if you have a question for Brandon, you can submit that using the chat feature, and Margaret will get to as many questions as she can. I'm going to let Margaret introduce Brandon, but first let me tell you a little bit more about Margaret Noodin. She received an MFA in creative writing and a PhD in English and linguistics from the University of Minnesota. She is professor of English and American Indian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she also serves as the Associate Dean of the Humanities and Director of the Electa Quinney Institute for American Indian Education. She is the author of Bawajamo, A Dialect of Dreams in Anishinaabe Language and Literature, as well as Waweni and What the Chickadee Knows, which are both bilingual collections of poetry in Anishinaabe-Moan and English. To hear more of Margaret's work, visit her website at www.ojibwe.net. Now, if you will, please join me in a Harbor Springs Festival of the Book welcome for Margaret Noodin and Brandon Hobson.
It's my pleasure to be here with Brandon tonight. Brandon Hobson is the author of the novel Where the Dead Sit Talking, which was a finalist for the 2018 National Book Award for Fiction and winner of the Reading the West Book Award. It is a novel of living and dying and what happens when worlds change. It's a story of Cherokee history in America and the Anaunwa language and culture that is beyond America. His other books include Desolation of Avenues Untold and the novella Deep Ellum. His work has appeared in the Pushcart Prize anthology, The Believer, and the Paris Review, Daily, Conjunctions, Noon, and McSweeney's, among other places. He is an assistant professor of creative writing at New Mexico State University, and he teaches in the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. He is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation tribe of Oklahoma, and it's a real pleasure. I know that many of us have spent time with the book. It's a real pleasure to actually be at least in the same space and speaking with you, Brandon. So for me, it was just really wonderful that you're writing something so specific and you're writing across so many different times. And I just wanted to start by asking what you wanted to share. What was your intention for readers to learn about the Anaunwa, the principal people?
Well, a lot of it was thinking about specifically how violence affects natives, and specifically with the Cherokee Nation. I was thinking about not so much explaining specific things about the tribe as I was thinking about grief and how people handle grief and how grief goes back for 200 years, and certainly goes back to the Trail of Tears and what led to the Trail of Tears. And so that was a big part of it. I don't know that I was specifically trying to explain anything. I think that often non-native readers are looking for explanation, and then that becomes problematic because native writers shouldn't feel like they have to explain, right? So, yeah. So it's not necessarily that I'm trying to explain anything as I'm exploring, as what Chekhov said, that fiction should explore questions. And so that the main question that I wanted to explore is how this Cherokee family is dealing with not only the grief of their son being shot by a police officer, but also the ancestral grief that's happened for many, many years.
Yeah, no, I loved it. I think that you have an amazingly relevant voice, but one where you're sharing the lived trauma of any moment in history when a family loses someone, or when a family finds themselves on the wrong side of society, or on the wrong side of people that might be dominating their community or attempting to change who they are. So it was amazing to see you reckon with such serious issues and relevant issues in such a realistic way in two different, really multiple different time periods. But I think of the way that you talked about the trail that folks were on and how that actually felt made that history so much more real and connected to the history today. I think people talk a lot about historical trauma, but I think you showed exactly how that can play out. Were you thinking of historical trauma when you were writing these scenes?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, thank you for saying that. I mean, that was a big part of this book early on. Was I wanted to have a spirit ancestor of a family and be a part of the narrative. And originally, this book was very non-linear in terms of the timeline. And my editor worked with me more to make it a little bit easier for readers to understand the timeline being a week that leads up to the Cherokee National Holiday, which is also happens to be the anniversary of when Ray Ray gets shot. Well, originally the book was non-linear, and so the different family members were going through their stories at different times, and so we decided ultimately to make the timeline much clearer. But to go back to the beginning was Chala, the ancestor, because he exists out there somewhere, and he's in, as he addresses early on, time is irrelevant from where he's speaking. And so his sections are very sort of non-linear. And so I knew early on that I wanted to address talking about Chala's death and the removal of the tribe.
Yeah, they're amazingly powerful passages. I had made a note to ask you to actually read a little bit of a passage from Chala, if you would be willing to do that. One of the most powerful points that I felt his voice came through was when he said, "Beloved, the earth will always speak to us when we need to hear her the most." That was just one of the many times where I thought, what a good reason to have read this book, to hear those voices from other times that mean so much to us now. And I think that part is on maybe page 197, but you could really read any of his passages. They're all really good.
No, I will read that. Yeah, in fact, that was the one that I had turned to originally. So. Beloved, the earth will always speak to us when we need to hear her the most. Even in my time, We were worried about rising oceans and burning land. I always looked for warnings. Our family believed strongly in Tecumseh's warning of the soldiers coming to remove us from our land. There was a drought. There were high winds and a bitter cold winter. You are aware that this is a terrifying time for us. We were frightened, but ready to defend our home. Our people would refuse to leave, even though we were tricked by the government with their fraudulent treaty. We did not trust them. It was raining the night we rounded up a few families and quietly snuck away to hide in a cave in the mountains. I told the other people in the Cherokee language, what we do will affect our people for years to come. I thought of all my visions, our visions, the prophecy of the coming migration, and hoped they would be proven false. That night in the cave, one of the wives was so afraid for her new baby that she ran out into the rain with a tomahawk, yelling, kill, kill. She felt the presence of a spirit's strength so powerfully that she threw the tomahawk into the night sky in the rain, and it never came down again, was never found anywhere. That night it hailed large ice pellets. We were there 10 nights before they arrived to destroy our homes. We watched from afar as the ones who swarmed on our land like a pack of wolves began firing their weapons. Now there was a great threat upon us. The soldiers were ordered to be civil, but they destroyed our cabins and barns. They slaughtered our chickens and hogs and cattle. They prodded our wives and elders with bayonets as they forced them out of their homes and to stockades. By the end, many of our people had nothing but their clothes. Everything else was gone. We felt a great misery spread throughout our land. Soldiers dug into graves to steal the gold from our dead, never bothered by the stench of corpses that filled the air. Though we were safe in seclusion, two other men and I couldn't stand that we were not helping our people, so we set out, armed with our weapons. And you, my brave son, you came with us. At once the soldiers saw us approaching, and soon they surrounded us. We attacked and fought, but there were too many of them. One of them hit you with a shovel, and I lunged at him with my knife, cutting his arm. The other soldiers pulled me off and held me down. They tied us with rope. I told them to kill me first, but they did not agree. I closed my eyes and lowered my head as they pointed their rifles at us. I begged you not to open your eyes, even when they told you to. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for reading that. It is just something you almost have to sit with. I found myself reading the book in pieces intentionally so that I could kind of take each piece separately and then put them together in my mind before moving on. There's so much to talk about the content. I think that's something that people have submitted a few questions on. So maybe I'll leave that for a moment. And I wanted to just ask you a little bit about the craft. Can you say something about the way you've structured the book, the bones of it, and how you see it coming together? It's actually amazing to think that it's a circle around just a few days in September. And you've mentioned a little bit about, that central historic date, but can you talk about what it was to write an entire story and then keep it grounded in a short amount of time?
That was one of the challenges of writing this book, was structuring it. Because I had said earlier, I had originally written an early draft of this novel not in nonlinear time. In other words, each of the characters' thread were each was happening at a different time period. And the more that began to feel more like individual stories rather than one complete novel. And so I knew that I wanted to make this novel, to braid this novel in some way that dealt with this question of grief and how we heal. And so as I revised and continued to rewrite it, because that's what we do, is to continue to rewrite until we get it where we want it. And so I started thinking about specifically the structure of following each character and applying some sort of authorial reticence, which is a term post-structuralists use. I don't know if anybody is familiar with that, but I've always been interested in a very Baroque style, a depart from a traditional structure, and looking at how fragmented narrative can apply a feeling for the reader that also employs a fragmented reality to the story. So fragmentation, blurring the line between fantasy and reality to try to enhance the reading experience. Those are all things that I was thinking about, because I knew I didn't want this to be a traditional narrative. Now, many readers would say, well, that sounds very complicated and it's a little bit frustrating. And my reply, good, because I want, in a sense, I want the reader to be a little bit frustrated. And I want the reader to come away with some unanswered questions, because that's a lot of the theme behind this book. So I'm interested in language being a fragmented departure from tradition. By tradition, I mean traditional narrative, in order to employ that.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's a really interesting way to approach it. I think it really works. It's so interesting to see the stories kind of wind around one another in the way that, we often all hear of our own story in our head, our own narratives unfolding, and, we forget how many other stories are unfolding simultaneously. Question that I had, how did you gain the confidence to write from so many different perspectives? I mean, these characters are different generations. Clearly, they have different views in the world. Some of them struggle with different parts of their own existence. Can you talk a little bit about how you develop characters and find yourself writing about a character that's very unlike yourself, really?
Well, that's one of the joys, actually, of being a fiction writer, is to create characters function on their own. At some point, when we really understand a character, they tend to take a life of their own. I know that I heard those voices in my head early on. Even Sonia's voice I heard early on. The one voice that I really, really could not hear was Maria's. And so early on, I wrote Maria's sections in third person. Ultimately began texting with a woman I've known since I was little, friend of my mom's, who had lost her son when he was a teenager. And she wanted to remain anonymous, and fine. I just wanted to get a sense of what it feels like and what it sounds like for someone grieving years after a traumatic event, such as losing a child. And I was really struggling as a writer. I was struggling in Maria's voice with her and really talked a lot with her until I felt comfortable. So that's where some of the journaling, some of the dream, some of the descriptions of dreams came from out of my discussions with her, and eventually my editor trying at Maria's section to be consistent with the rest of the book. So I did, and we worked on it. We worked very hard on it. I hope that I got Maria's voice down after a lot of hard work and many drafts going through line by line with my editor, that we were able to get. And so the specific, like Edgar or voices, and I knew that at some point both of them are very different than I am. And so that's what we do as fiction writers. Eventually we allow the characters to sort of take control on the page, because they're going to react in very specific ways to situations and things. And so that's what happened.
It's amazing. No, I think you did a really good job getting that between all of the characters. Was great too. So, I know that folks had questions, so I want to see if we can get to some of those as well, because I've already taken up time with my own curiosities, and I'll read some of the questions that people sent in, and folks are certainly invited to put another question in the chat if they want to. But there's, of course, conversations about reincarnation. I would say perhaps there's ways that you want things to be clear and ways that you don't, but what would you want to share to us or share with us? The question that was sent in is Wyatt part of the reincarnation theme? And if so, is he a Ray or Chala reincarnation, or combination of both?
Well, again, I think this comes back down to that authorial reticence that I'm very interested in, which is purposefully withholding information in a post-structuralist way that allows the reader to sort of make those decisions for themselves, that I'm not pushing some specific agenda on the reader, that this is exactly the explanation in the exact way that I'm trying to say about this specific moment in the book. I will say that I'm very, very interested in spiritual, in this book, I'm very interested in spiritual manifestations and how spirits reappear throughout the book, and that there's blurring the line between fantasy and reality, right? That the Darkening Land, where Edgar goes, for example, becomes this place that comes out of the traditional stories, this darkening land that feels very fantasy, but at the same time, I wanted to make it not much different than the world that we're living in, right? The natural world. So there's a fine line there between the two. And I think that one could believe certainly that Wyatt withholds the spirit of, or holds the spirit of Ray and or Chala, or maybe Wyatt is just Wyatt, and because the parents have experienced such trauma and such loss, that Wyatt becomes a representation of hope, a kind of metaphor for hope, that it becomes more than just that what they feel like. It's more than coincidence that this child is much like their child they lost many years ago, 15 years ago. But at the same time, maybe Wyatt is just there as a symbol for healing. So that's not really giving a clear answer, I understand. But as a reader, I'm really interested in drawing my own interpretations. And because I teach a lot, and because I've taught young people, one of the things that I've always tried to stress is for readers to make their own conclusions and back them up. And so I hope that with this book, a reader could draw her own conclusions and then back them up, right, with evidence that presents itself in more than one way.
Right, that's a good point. I mean, depending on what stories and experiences the reader brings to the book, they may read events a little bit differently. So you're saying there's no right answer there, which is good sometimes.
No, yeah, I don't want to say anything specific about reincarnation or any kind of specific belief system in terms of this book.
So we had another question that was more specific about the birds in the book. We had a couple of different questions, so I'm kind of blending them together here. We had a question about the owls and children's relationship with owls, and the fowl that is seen over and over. Can you talk a little bit about the birds that appear in the book and where those ideas came from and how they fit into the book?
Sure. Well, the red fowl is I understand it's a very strange part of the book. It represents a metaphor for addiction, for Edgar's addiction, in which case he early on has struggled with an addiction. And so when he gets the red fowl, it begins as a sort of baby bird, a baby fowl. And then slowly it grows and it grows as he continues to use. And then soon it becomes this cryptic, wicked, sort of ugly fowl that follows him everywhere he goes. So it's kind of a metaphor that follows him even into the darkening land, especially into the darkening land, that until it's destroyed, until that metaphor, that addiction is destroyed through his interaction with his ancestor, which becomes a kind of healing for Edgar. And once that healing is done, then the fowl is destroyed. The addiction is gone. And then Edgar is able to take the trail out of the darkening land and return home with his ancestors, with his family. And right. so that specific red fowl, and I chose, because I'm interested in language, I chose the word fowl because it's a cryptic word. Fowl, it's not like dove or blue jay or cardinal, which are kind of pretty words. I wanted it's kind of like grackle. Grackle's a great word because it's, they're kind of, they're kind of gross, right? And they're always around trash and garbage, and so fowl presented itself to me in that respect, that it became a metaphor, whereas the other birds aren't necessarily used as metaphors as they are more symbolic ways and spiritual ways. Certainly the owl. Because of the birds and the colors that I use, some of which are used in traditional Cherokee culture or important in traditional Cherokee culture, I wanted to apply certain colors to certain things. Reds, golds, greens, highly used in this book outside of the darkening land. Reds, golds, greens for Maria, following the trail out of the darkening land, and applying color throughout the book in so much description, not just of animal or a bird, but of land. And part of the reason for that attention to the detail of the land also has to do with the trauma that the land is experiencing, in the same way that the family, in other words, the land suffers, the land remembers history just as people do, and therefore becomes temperamental, deals with trauma in the land's own way.
It does seem that's something that Chala reminds us often, that the land remembers, that the land should be listened to, right? So,
yes.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. Another one of the questions that we had is related to the Cherokee stories that you tell. We had a couple of people ask how much of that was stories that you knew or things that you have heard in the past, and how much did you feel that you had to invent? Is it a little mixture of both? And can you talk a little bit more about how you wove those traditional Cherokee tales into the novel?
I think in the final version, there were originally a lot more in an earlier version. In fact, there were so many that my editor said, okay, you're going way overboard with all these extra stories, that they would be a little bit too hitting the reader over the head with too many of those stories and not keeping the reader grounded enough, and which is a fair point. The ones that remain in there, I think, are all from the Cherokee stories, which were arrived in Oklahoma, and they were written down by a man named James Mooney, who documented many, many different stories, and it's easily accessible. You can read Mooney's version of the oral traditional stories very easily, and so which he refers to as myths, and he calls some of them earth myths and spiritual myths and creation myths, and myth being a word meaning story here. And so I think the ones in this final draft of the novel are all from traditional stories. The ones that I stretched for the most, or that I came up with, that I think were all cut by the final version. Chala's stories himself, of course, are all out of my imagination. But the wolf, he does tell a story about the animal speaking to him through its eyes, and that's not from a traditional. That's not from a traditional story, and kind of to serve with a prophecy of the animal saying the soldiers are coming to give Chala that sort of prophecy, because Chala following real people like Dragging Canoe, Tecumseh. Dragging Canoe and Tecumseh were two we can call them prophets, who foresaw the soldiers coming, the tribes being removed, the destruction coming over, and the violence coming over the tribes. So in a way, Chala is much like Dragging Canoe and Tecumseh.
Well, that's great. There's a couple of, I'm trying to juggle the questions here, the multiple questions. Sure. There's one here that I'll just maybe read directly from the chat. The character Ernest, early on, they're struggling with the Alzheimer's. Well, let's see if I can get to this right. Sorry, it popped ahead. But basically, it's about him saying, stop asking if I remember things. And that whole challenge, the way that you're weaving in loss of memory in a very specific relationship with loss of memory in a community. I guess the question really is, how does this work? How complex was it, or how difficult was it for you to be looking at loss that is communal and loss that is individual at the same time?
Yeah, and that's a big part. I mean, again, a big part of this book is loss, and loss from communal, but also the loss of what is feeling as memory. And memory is so important. Even the earth remembers. And so for Ernest, losing, we can choose what to remember, but what happens when we lose that ability to choose to remember what we can remember. And I was thinking about memory in general when I was drafting this novel, and how important memory is, and also how nonlinear memory is. In other words, we have memories, but they don't follow a linear structure, a linear timeline. We can remember something yesterday and then 5 minutes later remember something from 20 years ago, 50 years ago, or whatever. So memory doesn't follow a linear timeline, which is to say that I wanted Chala's sections to not follow necessarily a linear timeline. And early in the book, again, the book was non-linear, but I think it was so non-linear with all the different stories happening at different times, it became a little bit too confusing, I think.
Life's confusing.
but life is confusing. Yeah. I think it's so even with the timeline of, which means just basically I just stuck a date in there. September 1st, September 2nd, September, and going, leading up, each section, going over a period of 6 days or so until the Cherokee National Holiday, the event of the bonfire. So, yeah.
I appreciated learning all of this. For us here in Anishinaabe, we have a large diaspora that tends to sort of dominate our idea of indigeneity up here. And it was really fun to hear the specificity with which you sort of introduce other histories, other ways of being indigenous in North America. I apologize to those who sent in questions that I'm not reading verbatim. Sometimes the questions are overlapping a little bit. But I know we've got about 15 minutes left, and there's two that I want to make sure we get to. One is, as a writer of a novel like this, and as someone who teaches other people to become writers and tell stories, especially in your role at IAIA, what do you believe the U.S. government should do to ameliorate the well-being of the removed Indigenous people? Is there such a thing as addressing the loss that these communities have experienced?
Well, that's
a big question, right? I thought, well,
that's a big question. How long do we? Is this a 4-hour segment? We could spend a long time talking about that. I mean, I think that the big thing for me is in education and learning. Now, I grew up and have lived my entire life in Oklahoma, so a big part of Oklahoma history was drilled into me from the time I was very young, not just with family and friends, but I mean at school. That's clearly Rick Santorum proved just the other day how ignorant people are and how privileged they are to. And I apologize, I don't mean to offend anybody, but his statements the other day that he made on CNN about there not being any kind of native culture, right?
Yeah.
What comes out of, I mean, for me, it's why are we not teaching more?
Yes.
And people ask me a lot. They will say, what other Native writers should I be reading? I've read Louise Erdrich, and I've read In Scott Momaday. They might mention one or two others. And I could just, go down a list and say, look, these were, especially in the last few years, we're seeing a lot of, this is what's really exciting. There's a lot of younger Native writers. And one of the reasons I moved to New Mexico was that I had an opportunity to work with Native students, not just at IAIA, but down here at New Mexico State, where there's the Tortugas and Navajo that I have a lot of my students here. So marginalized communities I'm very interested in working with for the rest of my life in terms of students. But there are so many opportunities that we have now, especially I think for young people, to educate them much more, not only from a historical standpoint, but in storytelling. What a great time. I'm being very optimistic. I'm being very hopeful. What a great time for poets, for storytellers, and for essayists to come forward now and to develop their craft and to tell their stories of the hundreds of tribes and communities and cultures that are out there, and their stories that can really, really enlighten a lot of people, including me, because I'm from Oklahoma, but there's so many tribes out there that I love reading my students from First Nations Canada or from Alaska. We get students from all over and Native students and reading their stories about their communities or their culture. And so I think that, through education, I hope that this is an opportunity that now we're starting to see some things and some discussions happen that we're not just being sort of pushed aside in terms of Native storytellers, right?
Yeah, that was a question one person asked. How is it different with this novel? Do you notice things changing? And in a sense, you have addressed that a little bit, that the times, I would say that it has changed rapidly in recent years. Even just the last year or two, I see more voices able to be individual voices, not feeling they have to conform to a kind of a common denominator or sort of a pan-tribal view.
Absolutely. The pan-tribal, which is great. It's somewhere like at IAIA, and I go there and there are numerous tribal representation, students, faculty, community in Santa Fe, and yet everybody just feels it's just such a great community to be there, right? And despite all the differences in tribal affiliation, but one thing that I think is very hopeful also is avoiding the stereotype, because for many, many, many years, especially Hollywood has been the world's worst at portraying Native communities or Native identities in stereotype, right? And avoiding the stereotype. So there's this new show, Rutherford Falls, that's on Peacock. That's fantastic. My friend Sterling Harjo from Tulsa, Oklahoma, is filming Reservation Dogs about some young people. And my friend Tommy Orange's book a couple of years ago is about Oakland urban natives.
Big city powwows,
In big cities, and especially in Oklahoma, you got Tulsa and Oklahoma City are full of natives, and so there are urban. Not everybody falls into this specific stereotype that I feel like Hollywood has done a very poor job in the past.
Oversimplified, yes. I have students too where I teach, and I always, try and encourage them to celebrate all of who they are, because I've got students who are, they are Oneida and Ho-Chunk or Ojibwe and, Dakota. They're mixed identity, and rather than have that blurred together, I think it's always really fun when they explore the stories on either side of their family and get into it a little bit more. I know we don't have too much time left, and everybody's been great about being with us here this evening, and it's been just such a treat to hear you. And I was really tickled that you actually read the piece that I was hoping you would read, so that was a good coincidence. But the one other question that someone had submitted, which was on my list to ask you as well, so what are you working on now? What are you thinking of doing next?
Thanks for that. I'm actually working on a middle grade book.
Nice.
And specifically a group of kids who are Cherokee Nation, one of whom is not. And so it's an opportunity. Andrew Jackson, for example, appears in the body of a possum, and and is cornered back, and is can't form sentences very well. And they kind of go on this journey. It's been a really fun. It's a fun project right now. I do have two other big projects too that will. One is another novel, and I've only just outlined and written about 40 pages. It's very early in the drafting. And then I have a collection of stories that I've written over the past 15 years, some of which have been published, that is also on the back burner of something that I might try to get into a collection, because I've never collected all my short stories in a book form. So the collection, but the novel, I'm very excited about the novel, and I'm also excited about this middle grade book, which will be relatively short. It's not going to be anything giant, but it's. I hope to finish it by the end of the summer, a draft of it, and then go on to the novel after that. So it'll be a little while before the next adult novel comes out. But I've got those three things basically all in the pot right over here that I'm
see which one rises to the surface.
Yeah.
A couple people also, as we were talking here, submitted questions about how this book, which I'm sure you started, I mean, it takes time to publish a thing quite a while ago, and you can connect it to events in the news now when you think of Native people and Native communities and how they've had difficult relationships with the police often. Someone had asked, how do you see these things connected, these current events? Do you intentionally try to connect with current events, or do you really just sort of see the events happening in communities and let them fit into the books as they get done?
I had, before this time last year, the book was done. It takes over a year. There was an event that happened back in 2014 in Oklahoma. There have been several Native teenagers who have been shot by police officers. There's a family called the Good Blanket family, which is the Cheyenne and Arapaho family in western Oklahoma, who lost their son, called the police for help for him. They were afraid he was going to hurt himself. And he ended up losing his life. But that inspired me a little bit to connect a teenage shooting to this book, because as I explored and researched, I saw other stories about young people being shot by the government and by the police, and I thought, well, that's interesting, because the book Ojibwe Warrior that Dennis Banks wrote, which by the way is a fantastic autobiography, and Dennis Banks started the American Indian movement back in the early 1970s. That's a fantastic. Russell Means was another one. Became an actor, but was an activist and part of the American movement, and has a book called Where White Men Fear to Tread. Anyway, those books talking about violence in Minneapolis against natives from the police, and how that seems to continue to go on, and thinking the same sort of violence happened 200 years ago and continues to happen. And so all of that, I knew I had to write a novel, because I thought, my gosh, all this violence.
Yeah.
But not focusing so much on the violence as I wanted to focus on the aftermath, and really think about how trauma and how healing, how difficult those things are for people after historical trauma, ancestral trauma, continues to be a part of people's lives, and all coming out of violence.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, you even address violence against women, and you really
Yes.
look at the precarity of children as well. I mean, kids are just they have so little control over their environment. And
Sure.
I think you really show ways to be resilient. You don't just show one and focus on the negative. You show a lot of ways to be in the world, that's for sure.
Well, thank you. I did try to focus. I'm glad you mentioned resilience, because I think that ultimately, as dark and sad as this book sounds, for if someone has not read it and I've been talking about, I do hope that it ends on a note of hope and resilience. I do hope that it ends on that, and because even though things are not resolved yet, we can hope. Right? We have hope, and we can still be resilient, a resilient people from trauma, and so that was a big part of this book.
That
absolutely
is possibly a perfect note on which to end. I know we've used up our hour here, but yeah, I definitely feel that hope came through, and really, it's a wonderful novel. It's a good way to
thank you.
Collection of people who can show us how to survive. These people face some really difficult situations and find their way through them, as we all have to. So thank you for this gift of hope you put in the novel.
Well, thank you so much. I know it's a difficult book. If it means anything, I wanted it to be a difficult, not in terms of how hard it is, structure or language wise, but in terms of thinking about all of these are big things, but important. I feel like they're important issues.
Yeah.
So
yes. Well, thank you so much. I know people had planned to be with us for an hour, and some things about Zoom are strange and awkward, and they don't always work. But in the end, we got to see you, and we had nearly 100 people with us here tonight. So thank you so much for the novel itself, for all that you do, the teaching, and the gift that you bring us. Thanks for
thank you. Thank you, Margaret, and also Amy and Harbor Springs. I was there at the festival in 2018, and it was what a beautiful place on the lake, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. And I felt so honored to be there, Harbor Springs, for that. So if you ever want to invite me back, I would love to come.
I sure hope you're taken up on that. Yes. Well, from up here in the Great Lakes area, Gumagwechwigo, we all thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate you taking the time, and thanks to everyone for reading and attending.